All right. So without further ado, I am really happy to present our speaker today, somebody from outside of our group, which is always a pleasure. Um, we have Jeremy Grove presenting with us today, who is an assistant professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences here at Duke. Um, and he has done some really interesting work when it comes to alcohol use disorder. And we're going to hear about some of that today, which uh, looks at ecological, I think it's called ecological momentary assessment. And he'll tell us more about what that is and what it looks like as it relates to suicidal ideation. So this relationship between alcohol and suicidal ideation is something I've been thinking a lot about. So I'm really eager to hear what we have today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you. You should be able to share your screen, I hope,
Let me
and
try.
get started when you're ready.
Okay, let's see here. Can you guys see them?
We
Yes.
do. We're seeing future directions. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wrong slide. Okay. So
Some
yeah,
people like to start with the end.
yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So thank you for the introduction. Yeah. So I'm a psychologist within psychiatry, and I my research really focuses on understanding correlates of suicidal ideation and behavior. And one of the things that I'm really interested in these days is how alcohol consumption or alcohol use and alcohol use disorder is a correlation with and potentially a predictor of suicidal ideation and behavior. So, suicidal thoughts and behaviors, it's a public issue. You know, there's been a lot of progress over time, the last couple of decades in terms of developing methods of risk assessment, and yet rates of suicide have been relatively stable over time. In large part, the difficulty lies within the fact that suicide-related phenomena are really difficult to predict. This is for a number of reasons, but chief among them is the fact that suicidal thoughts and urges fluctuate in intensity um, within a given individual pretty rapidly across short time periods. So we're talking, even within minutes. So somebody at one point can feel completely fine, and then, 2 minutes later, feeling suicidal. 5 minutes later, okay again. So, it's kind of a moving target essentially. So it really makes it really difficult to intervene at the exact moment that the person really does need the intervention. So what I'm referring to is timely interventions. So we need more timely interventions for suicide risk, given that it is fluctuating across short time periods. And what I mean by timely interventions is really something in some way to sort of deploy interventions at the exact moment that the person needs it the most, because that's when you get the most bang for your buck, essentially. And there has been progress on this, such that, we have smartphones and their technology that are now equipped essentially to deliver automated interventions at moments when risk is high. But and it's important, those interventions are really only effective if prediction is accurate and the target. So in other words, the thing that's causing the spike in suicide risk is known. So in the absence of predicting spikes in suicide risk, which often rely on self-report, and let's be real, I mean people who are really suicidal and want to kill themselves are probably not going to self-report, at least not right away. And so the next best thing is to be able to predict for a given individual other momentary factors that tend to rise and fall with suicide risk over short time periods. So these are things like internal processes and contextual factors that we call time varying correlates. And these things are the things that tend to rise and fall in intensity alongside suicide risk in real time. So alcohol is a time varying correlate of particular interest to me. As I said earlier, alcohol has long been identified as a risk factor for suicide. And there's evidence that alcohol consumption is actually a dose response relationship with acute suicidality. such that greater consumption of alcohol, corresponds to greater intensity and lethality of suicide attempts. But for the most part, we know very little about how alcohol contributes to suicidality in real time, moment to moment, because most research to date has been retrospective or cross-sectional. And so that's not really going to cut it. What we really need to do to look at alcohol as a momentary predictor, so across short time periods, um, is to conduct intensive longitudinal studies. And so I know that sounds probably very boring right now. I promise I'll try to make it more bite-sized so it's less boring. So just a little bit more background. So I received grant funding from NIH to do an ecological momentary assessment study, or EMA, to collect preliminary data on this. So EMA is a useful tool to capture snapshots of fluctuating phenomena in real time. So this is typically via smartphone surveys delivered to one's phone several times per day over the course of several weeks. So the study I'm going to go over today is this kind of EMA work, such that participants are repeatedly asked each day over several weeks their current level of suicidal ideation and whether they're feeling cravings for or are currently engaging in alcohol consumption at the exact time they're pinged to complete the survey. So the overarching study aim for this pilot study is to use this methodology to explore within subject association between momentary alcohol craving and suicide ideation. So within subject association just simply means whether and the extent to which fluctuating phenomena correlate in real time within a given person. So, if such a within subject correlation tends to occur across lots of people, then it's probably, something worth paying attention to in order to predict the thing you are really interested in. And for my work, that's suicide-related phenomena. So, as you might expect, my hypothesis going into the study is that alcohol craving is a time-varying correlate of suicidal ideation, such that SI will tend to be elevated at moments when alcohol craving is higher than usual for a given person. And then you might be wondering why I'm looking at craving and not consumption. That's just because, for whatever reason, for this particular sample, we had pretty low endorsement of alcohol consumption. So we had to settle for alcohol craving. All right, so I'm going to try to go over the methods pretty quickly so we can get to the good stuff. So we collected EMA data from 32 adults recently discharged from Duke Regional Hospital, the acute psychiatry unit, for a suicide crisis. And we enrolled people who reported at least some history of alcohol use. And then for 6 weeks after discharge in their own environments, participants were tasked with answering 6 surveys per day, randomly distributed over 14-hour wait periods. And you can see in the photo there, yeah, that's kind of an example of what the surveys look like. They're brief, just a few minutes, so you don't want to overburden participants. And they only have an hour to complete each survey, and that's just because you want to make sure that you're capturing the snapshot in time that you're actually trying, like the time point that you're actually trying to capture, as opposed to capturing something retrospectively. And what happens is when you get enough of these snapshots over time, you can start to see how phenomena changes over short time periods. But you need these individual snapshots to do that. So we assess current level of SI by asking, right now, how intense are your thoughts of suicide? And rating on a scale of 0, not at all, to 5, extremely. And then we also asked that about alcohol craving as well, using this like a similar scale of 0 to 5. And so to analyze the data, we used a random coefficients model, which is just a fancy term for conducting regression model for each person in the study, allowing for slopes to differ between people. So, and we also person-centered alcohol craving, which is typical for longitudinal research. And this just really allows us to say how and when a person's experiencing something different relative to their average experience. So we had decent compliance. So that just means survey adherence. So what percentage of surveys are actually being completed versus all the surveys being deployed. And so we had 79% compliance, which isn't the best, but with clinical populations, it's actually as good as it gets, just because typically these people who are from clinical populations, they tend to be experiencing a lot of chaos in their lives, and it's hard for them to respond to a survey on a sort of reliable, normal basis. But 79% is definitely good enough and enough for us to be able to analyze these data. And then so the interclass correlation, excuse me, or ICC, but they were both good for SI and craving. So that just means that there was enough fluctuation in the phenomena in this sample across short time periods to be able to look at within subject associations. So, consistent with hypotheses, we found that within a given individual, when higher alcohol craving was higher than usual for a given individual, it tended to be associated with increased SI at the same time point. So that just means that it's demonstrating a concurrent within subject association between SI and alcohol craving. And then if you look at that, what we call it, the spaghetti plot graph, it demonstrates that. So each line there is an individual slope. And then that thick blue line is just the fixed effect, or in other words, like the average across people where that slope is. And so that's like the average within subject association between alcohol craving and SI. And so we also found what we call a random effect, and it just basically means that the association that we're demonstrating here between alcohol craving and SI at the same time point tended to be stronger when people reported higher SI at their baseline. So in other words, alcohol craving is particularly telling among those who are at the highest risk. So what this all means is that, we have preliminary evidence that alcohol craving is a time-varying correlate of SI. And this is potentially useful because, if replicated, assessment of alcohol craving for at-risk people can be a proxy assessment for risk of SI. And so, like I said earlier, that's critical because, many people don't report SI even when asked, for obvious reasons. But they're not as shy about reporting alcohol. So if you can ask about alcohol and you know they're at risk for suicide, and you hear that they've been drinking a lot or they have cravings to drink, you might suspect that they might also be feeling suicidal, or they might at some point within the next couple of minutes to hours, they might at some point. And so that's why this is useful. So there's not really, we don't really know why this association exists. It's hard to believe, at least for me, how alcohol would actually somehow cause SI or vice versa. But, maybe there's like some sort of shared underlying factor driving both phenomena. So, if I had to guess or had to speculate, maybe it'd be like negative affect or some sort of emotional problem that might be driving both behaviors. Um, because both alcohol use and suicidality tend to occur in the context of difficult emotions. It's typically. But if there is like a unifying underlying factor for both phenomena, it may be down the road, it may be possible that we could develop a just-in-time intervention to simultaneously target both issues, which would be kind of cool. So, as is always the case, there are definitely some limitations to the study. So, this is a preliminary study, which means that we didn't have as many people, and the model is really simple. So, we only really looked at alcohol and suicide risk without accounting for the likely multitude of state and trait-like processes that are probably contributing to the process. We also have a chicken and egg problem too. So, from, you know, we don't know essentially the ordering of the events. So does alcohol craving come before SI, or does SI predict subsequent alcohol craving? Or is it a bidirectional thing? We just don't know from the study. And we also only looked at internal processes. So suicide ideation, alcohol cravings, but we didn't look at actual behaviors. So we don't know from the study if the within subject association that we demonstrated actually occurs in with the behaviors. So when I say behaviors, I just mean suicide attempts and alcohol consumption. So does drinking alcohol actually concurrently within a given moment and a given person occur when someone's drinking? So, future directions, I think this is the slide that we started with. We need more studies that are powered for these, for complex modeling, which would allow us to understand for whom, why and under which context alcohol craving and use confers suicide risk at a given moment for a given person. And, knowing this would allow for like a more accurate prediction of suicide in real time, which can then get us to a point of targeted and timely assessment and interventions for suicide risk. And with timely assessment and interventions will come the possibility of being able to really actually prevent something that's really just a terrible thing that is a preventable behavior, but just is really difficult to catch, in a given moment. So that is the goal, and it has been for a very long time. And for me personally, alcohol is a thing that I'm hoping will be a useful target to do this. So I will stop there because I know presentations are only supposed to be 15 minutes or so. And I can just go ahead and stop. Would you like me to stop sharing or go to a slide or how do
Yeah,
you?
I think that's fine if you want, and we can kind of have some conversation. So thank you. That was great. Let's thank Jeremy. And if folks have questions, comments,
I
that
thought
would be great.
Yes. Hey, Jeremy, Tom Visasi here in the room. So first of all, it's great to hear an experience with using EMA for this kind of survey and work. I'm gonna be following your work forward because that's a theme that has always been interesting to me. Uh, just for context, I have a background in psychology and done my share of psychometrics work. And
Yeah.
so this kind of assessing people repeatedly it's something I've been interested in. So I'm going to ask you some questions, but also just to mention I would like to follow up on some things that we could potentially discuss in partnership. One of the areas that I've always tried to investigate, haven't done a good job at it, but there's some interesting work we're doing now with alcohol assessment using digital behavioral tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And it part of the argument of doing the what we're calling the AUBPT work that I have Sid and Paige here in the room that are leading this work is to try to create an interface where the repeated assessment can be done in a way that it reduces fatigue and maybe is a little bit more appealing to the user.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, very initial work. And then there's some other elements to why we wanted to do assessment at that level. So the question I wanted to make was, you did mention in the presentation compliance, but overall, when you're in your experience of having people reply the same survey over time, and looking at your ICCs, there's a large variation. So some people change their responses completely. Some people follow the same standard. What is your perception of the feasibility of doing EMA with this digital version of the self-reported tests? What are the barriers? What are the challenges that you perceive on the data side for those? And then if you have explored some sort of gamified version of it.
Yeah, so a really good question. And I think there are a lot of obstacles to EMA work. One of them is something I mentioned earlier, but is can be pretty burdensome. And you really can't know what kind of snapshot you're getting and whether or not it's actually a valid response or whether someone's driving, in their car and they get a ping and they're just like hurrying up to answer the survey item. So you just kind of have to kind of like just know that there's going to be a lot of noise that you have to account for, which will just kind of that's just going to have to be a thing with EMA research. In terms of gamification, I think that's such a good question because the things that we do kind of see with EMA work and just like digital interventions in general is that engagement tends to drop off. Usually after a couple of days to weeks, depending on. I mean, you have sometimes those really sort of like, giddy and engaged folks who don't need that extra boost or extra reinforcement to have, sustained interest. but that's usually not the typical participant. So what we do in our work, and it may not be feasible for everybody, it just depends on what your budget is we pay people per survey, what they complete, and then there are certain bonuses that they can earn depending on how compliant they are each day or each week, depending on it depends on how you want to structure the reward and bonuses. But we found that that really helped. But even still, with payment, and I feel like relative to other studies I've done, like we were able to pay them pretty generously, and even still, we saw some drop off across the board after a couple of weeks. So I think it's an ongoing issue with EMA studies and digital interventions in general. And I would love to, if we ever do get to collaborate, I would love to for us to be able to sort of think through like how can we be creative to, you know, help to keep people engaged and not sort of get really bored with the study. Because I mean, honestly, when you're getting asked repeatedly the same questions every single day, over,
Yeah,
multiple times per day, it gets a little old. So,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I keep thinking about I try to use one of those habit tracker on my phone,
uh-huh.
and it's always screaming at me because I forget to go back at it. So imagine answering questions
Exactly.
about things you might not necessarily want to answer about. Yeah, I can see that. Uh, the other question that I would like to make on the analysis side is if you explored because I've seen some people doing this work. I haven't had a chance to do it, but I've seen people do the work of EMA using longitudinal network models. And if you're familiar with that and have tried it or have any personal thoughts about it
I
compared to the linear model you're doing, yeah.
Oh yeah, so I'm familiar with it. I'm not as well versed in it. I do think that there's definitely a push for more network longitudinal network models because a lot of phenomena that, at least in my work in psychology, like clinical psychology and psychiatry, is not able to be predicted even with these sort of within subject models. It's highly personalized essentially, and so in order for you to be able to account for like an actual like a person's unique experience, you need to be able to do some of those like, sort of network models because everybody is different and everybody is different across different time points and within subjects. Modeling can account for some of that, but the like network modeling is something that is like goes a step forward in terms of being able to sort of personalize within a given individual these very minute and granular associations. So yes, there is definitely a push for that. And I am not a good person really to talk about like exactly what it looks like or the mechanics are like underneath that. But yes, it's definitely something that is going to be, I think, more talked about and used more often as modeling and longitudinal methodology continues to advance.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, of course.
Folks, any other questions? Questions online?
Yeah, feel free to put in the chat or unmute if you have any questions. I'm
Oh,
really interested in hearing more of your thoughts on the limitation and benefits of looking at craving versus consumption. It sounded like, um, you would have, if you had the more variation and uh, more use, you would have gone with that variable. But I think craving also shows us something interesting as well. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that. A couple of things occurred to me, which like if I were to be asked about craving as it relates to consumption. So for example, if I'm satisfying my craving, do I still call it a craving? You know what I mean?
mhm.
Because perhaps the craving was there, but because I've consumed, I would no longer report a craving, if that makes sense. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. But and I'm also curious, like the low reports of consumption, is that you think that's because some of these folks were, using other psychiatric medications being just discharged, or if you could just talk a little more about that.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely worth it to look at craving. I think that I'm more interested in consumption just because that is when someone is well, there's research to suggest that when someone actually uses alcohol and someone who's suicidal, that actually sets off a pretty sort of fast reaction in terms of just sort of like internal reactions, sort of like so negative affect, behavioral impulsivity, things like that. You would expect for somebody who's not suicidal would essentially it would be like gasoline on a fire. And so like that's like
You could see more of a causal effect than with craving, because with craving, as you pointed out, perhaps they're both being caused by some third factor, right?
Exactly, yes. But I do think your point is a good one, which is that, when does craving stop and when does consumption begin? And like are those two how related are those processes? And I don't think that's a question that's been answered, and I haven't really considered that much myself. I do think that craving is as a strong enough correlate of consumption to warrant it as a proxy of consumption. And people tend to crave or have urges to do a behavior before they do it. So there's definitely value in looking at it. And if it's not something that if we can't look at consumption, that's like the best we can do. I don't know why there wasn't as much drinking with this sample. I mean, I would have expected it, just given that, I mean, we recruited based off of people's recent history of alcohol use. My best assumption or hypothesis is that when people are discharging from, the hospital, there is a sort of like point or there's like a period of time where things are actually pretty good and they're really trying to remain stable and there are a lot of guardrails in place. And so a lot of the things that got contributed to them being hospitalized in the first place don't necessarily appear right away until they get out of that sort of like, I don't know, bubble, if you will, and then things start to unravel like they typically would. So that's my best guess. And yeah, but I was actually really surprised by that. And I'm not sure people were telling the truth either.
Of
Because
course, there's
we,
always
we've
going to be.
done previous studies where we asked people at the end of the study, what their experience was like, and were there any times when they weren't as honest in their reporting, and a lot of them were like, I didn't really want to report drinking that much because I felt kind of guilty about it. And the same was reported with suicidal ideation too. So I don't know exactly what was going on, but there are a couple of different things, one of which is maybe a reporting issue.
Gotcha. Thanks. Looks like William has a question. Welcome, William.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks
Go
for
ahead.
me. I know, like, I think the study is really interesting, trying to find out if we can identify the craving and fear. That's where we can try as much as possible to prevent the suicidal ideation, or at least get an entry point. I was just wondering if part of your future election will also be to include other important compounders that can also lead to suicidal ideation. They know like most people who are doing alcohol or using alcohol also have other substance abuse in play. So would that be something that you want to take on board, or have you done any part of this study, like taking into account other substance use and the study?
I had a hard time catching the last sentence. Or could you repeat yourself? Sorry.
Yeah, I was saying, like, did you also consider, like, in your study or in the future to include also to study other substance use which the population might be, because they are also related. Like, you can find a person using alcohol and they're using other substances, and all those together can actually maybe suicidal ideation. Could those be your future entry points?
Yeah, Yeah, I think that that's a really good question, and I do think that we see across substances, not all, but most of them, there is also an association with suicide ideation. Actually, there's some um, work, like preliminary work, that shows that cannabis use is a pretty strong correlate of suicidal ideation and behavior, and in some analyses outperforms alcohol. And we know also that there's a lot of co-use that occurs for people. So like people are drinking and either using cannabis concurrently, or they're using cannabis one day and then alcohol the next day. And we know that concurrent use and co-use is more potent in terms of an association with suicide risk than either substance alone. So I think that another limitation to the work that I just presented was that we didn't account for potential co-use or other substances that I'm certain were probably part of the picture. And so I know that like once I've been able to do a bigger study, it's powered more and with more money, I will definitely be looking at other substances in addition to alcohol because it's not often used in isolation with this kind of population.
Awesome. And I'm highlighting a comment from Jean Victor in the chat. Big question. I know you're not maybe not feeling there yet, but do you think your work can be used in public policy to decrease the suicide rate? If yes, how could this be done? I mean, I know you have a few steps in between, but what would you see ideally in the future?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if my work specifically, but this line of work of really trying to use EMA methods to understand, how these processes really change and what they look like in real time. That's the only way they're going to be able to prevent suicide. Because most people who want to kill themselves, they're not going to tell you. And often it's very impulsive. And so we have to figure out a different way to identify when risk is high and identify who is at risk. And so if my research and research like it is able to say like, okay, look, people won't necessarily report and may not even know how suicidal they are in a given moment, they may be more likely to report when they're wanting to drink alcohol or use cannabis, whatever. And if you know that person well enough, maybe we can deploy these interventions. So I mentioned in the talk just-in-time interventions, but these are like digital interventions where if, a person is stating in a survey that they're feeling or doing some certain thing, the algorithm can be designed to be like, okay, we know this person, whenever they're reporting this thing, they're probably at risk for suicide. And so since they're at risk for suicide, let this app rather send a recommendation to use a coping skill in the moment or talk to somebody instead of actually acting on any sort of suicidal impulse. And if we're able to sort of have that as an intervention tool, I think that's going to be the best way that we can reduce suicide rates. Because otherwise, it's just not going to change ever because it's just such an insidious and such a private process and really just difficult thing to intervene on without additional tools. And so we just really need those timely methods that I was referring to earlier. Whether or not it's going to be me or somebody else, I don't know. Hopefully someone.
Yeah.
I think we're closer than we've ever been. I'll say that.
Thank you.
And I'll take the privilege of one of our last questions. And thank you so much for joining us today. This was really, really interesting. And I'm sure that Joao and others will be following up to see how we can learn from each other and maybe collaborate in the future. My question is, our group, while we do work on US-based populations, we also are based all around the world. So I'm wondering, I was thinking about this when you were presenting some of the background information about some of these associations, some of the kind of theories behind what's going on, how much we see that vary around the world, or, how much some of this stays, and you may not know the answer to all these details, but, how much some of these things stay consistent around the world in terms of suicide and suicidal ideation?
Yeah, so we do know that suicide is a cross-cultural phenomenon. So that is definitely not, it's not culture bound by any means. Alcohol as a predictor may be more culture bound, just because I don't know how in different countries, I don't know how prevalent alcohol use is. And so I think that that's actually a really interesting question that I would have to I'd have to research. But I do think that there are common factors um, across cultures that we could sort of lean on in terms of trying to predict suicide and prevent suicide globally. So we know that people like suicide risk does fluctuate within a given person, even across cultures. We also know that suicide is highly taboo, and it is stigmatized, and so it's not going to be something that is a person's going to report um, easily or be willing to report, and that's something that happens across the board. And we also know that like the suicide rates they tend to be sort of comparable across cultures too. So it's just a thing that is a human to human thing. And in terms of like specific risk factors, I think those are the things that may vary across cultures. And I would suspect alcohol being one of them.
Yeah, I'm very curious about that. Okay, well, thank you so much. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Dr. Grove again for this great talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome to join us anytime. As you may have been told, now in our meeting, we moved to some more, I don't want to say tedious business, perhaps is a good way to characterize it. You're welcome to stick around and see how the sausage is made, but also I imagine you probably have other things to do. So thanks again.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.